Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. It's 9:01. I think we'll give people about one more minute to continue to log on here, as I see some people are still joining, and then we'll get going with the presentation. Thanks. All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning into our post-election webinar update. This is Alex Logeman at PeopleForBikes. I'm the Director of State and Local Policy here, and I am joined by our consultant from Washington, D.C., Charles Cooper. Charles, you want to say hello?
Sure. Great. Thanks for having me. I'm Charles Cooper. I work for a company called the Signal Group, and I work with PeopleForBikes up in Washington, D.C. Excited to be here.
Excellent. Let's just dive straight into the agenda and talk about what we're going to cover on the webinar today. We'll start out by covering a few ballot initiative wins. It was another excellent election in terms of voters approving new funding for both transportation infrastructure and outdoor recreation. Then we'll do a quick overview of what's going on in state legislatures across the country and governor's races and what these changes in power may mean for transportation funding and also our e-bike legislative campaign over the next couple of years. And then we'll turn it over to Charles to talk a little bit about federal elections, what the new Congress looks like, and what some opportunities for our industry may be as we look forward to the next 2 years of Congress. Quick overview of some of the election outreach we did at PeopleForBikes. By the numbers here, each time we have ballot initiatives that are going to affect transportation funding and bike riding, we try to do as much voter education as we can about those initiatives so that folks know how these different measures will be affecting bike riding. And just here's a few of the top line stats. Reached just over 500,000 people via email, tens of thousands of Facebook and Twitter impressions. And then we also have a ballot tracking page that you can check out. And I think we had a link to in the invitation email for the webinar, where we keep inventory of all of the different ballot measures that we are focused on. But bottom line, what do these outcomes mean for the ballot initiatives for the bike industry? We've got about $2 billion of funding for bike infrastructure and for outdoor recreation over the next decade that is going to be coming as a result of the outcomes of ballot initiatives this election. So it was definitely a significant victory in terms of the overall dollars that will be flowing into both on-road and off-road infrastructure over the next 10 years. Dive into a few specific outcomes for really noteworthy races, and I'll start with probably one of the most controversial election issues, at least in terms of a ballot measure across the country this year, and that was Proposition 6 in California. Proposition 6 was a measure that would have repealed the gas tax and vehicle fee increases that the legislature and the governor approved in 2017, and it also would have required voter approval for any future increases of either of those fee-raising mechanisms, so either the gas tax or any future vehicle fees. So this was really an initiative to essentially require taxpayer approval anytime that the state was going to try and raise new revenue for transportation. The measure did fail 56 to 44. It was a pretty contentious campaign, a lot of money spent on both sides. But what does this mean for bike funding? $100 million in annual funding for the state's main bike infrastructure program has been saved as a result of Prop 6 being defeated. The active transportation program is a fund that's funded about $200 million annually as a result of the 2017 legislation, and so that would have been slashed in half if Prop 6 had been approved. So this is a really significant win for bike funding in the state of California. To our home state of Colorado, our voters here faced two competing statewide measures, which was a little bit confusing. We had a more ambitious Proposition 110 that would have raised our state sales tax by a pretty good amount, 0.62%. We had a less ambitious Proposition 109, which was just a bonding measure, no new revenue involved, and all of the money there just would have gone to highway projects. So we endorsed Proposition 110 along with the other bike groups in the state as definitely the best measure for the future of bike riding in Colorado. It would have provided more money for multimodal projects, more money going to local governments that often use those funds for bike projects. But ultimately, both of these measures failed by a very similar margin, about 60% to 40%. What does this mean looking forward? The legislature earlier this year approved a sort of backstop initiative that would go into effect if both of these failed. So we're looking at about $650 million working its way through the pipeline to go to a range of highway projects, local government projects, and multimodal projects. So it's not a bad solution, but it's a partial solution. We have a $9 billion shortfall of transportation infrastructure funding in this state, and we're only looking at allocating about $645 million over the next 2 years, and then another 50 for another 10 years. So we're not getting as far as we need to get in terms of resolving that overall backlog, which was really the goal of Proposition 110. I'll talk a little bit more about what might happen in Colorado looking down the road in a few more slides. Georgia also passed a really noteworthy ballot initiative related to conservation. The outdoor industry, outdoor recreation industry, and also the land conservation community have been looking for new ways to, I think, demonstrate the amount of money that the uses that we do on public lands contribute to the overall economy and overall tax collections in a variety of states. And one of the ways we can do that is by calculating how much sales tax our businesses are generating and using those resources to go into dedicated funds for outdoor recreation. And so that's what voters have done in Georgia here. This was a constitutional amendment that diverts the existing sales tax that's collected on outdoor goods, and that includes bikes, into a dedicated fund for things like parks, trails, water quality, and wildlife. So based on the calculations that have been made, they're projecting about $20 million each year will go into a newly created fund called the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund. And this is a little bit of an experiment. So people will be watching this one pretty closely to see how well it works, if it's a model that can be used in other locations to think about good ways to sustainably fund public lands initiatives. A couple other noteworthy wins. Tucson, Arizona passed a pretty major transportation funding initiative, Proposition 407. It's going to provide about $91 million for new bicycle facilities. They're going to do a lot of work on off-street paths and greenways and things like that around the city. In Denver, Colorado, the news wasn't all bad in terms of outdoor recreation and infrastructure investments. Voters in Denver approved a sales tax increase, and that's projected to raise about $46 million annually for our parks and trails. Rhode Island passed a statewide question related to a number of environmental issues, but it did include some dedicated funding, about $12 million for the statewide bikeway network, and also some open space initiatives. That one passed overwhelmingly. And then Austin, Texas also had two big successes. Proposition C and G were two measures, one dedicated to transportation, one dedicated to recreation, but together, those are going to provide about $125 million for new bike paths, bike lanes in the city, and then also some Vision Zero programs that the city's working on. So some really good wins in cities and other states across the country. All right, with that, let's turn it over to talk a little bit about what happened in state legislatures. And as you can see here, the big takeaway is that there's a little bit yellow, less yellow on this map here. So on the left side of your screen, you can see a diagram that shows where Republicans controlled state legislatures, where Democrats controlled state legislatures, and then those yellow bubbles there are ones that were split. So one party controlled one chamber, a different party controlled the other. And we've got a little bit less yellow as we look at the map on the right side post-election. Minnesota is now the only legislature that has a split chamber. So with single party control, it may be a little bit easier for certain initiatives to move through. Democrats also did have some wins at the state level and took a few legislatures. You can see Colorado turned blue from split, Connecticut turned blue from split. New York's a little bit misleading, even though it's represented blue on the map on your left. They actually had a Republican-controlled Senate because of the way one of the Democrats votes, and it now is actually all blue. So that's sort of a lay of the land there. And then in governor races, kind of a similar narrative. Democrats flipped a few more seats than Republicans, and you can see the new breakdown here. It's a little bit closer to parity in terms of how many Republican governors we have versus how many Democratic governors, 27 to 23. And those numbers have changed from 33 to 17. So Democrats made some gains in governors' races across the country. Of course, if you've been watching the news, you've seen Florida and Georgia still have some contentious races going on. Those numbers that I've put above assume that the Republicans who are leading there ultimately prevail, but obviously we'll have to wait and see what happens as they go through possible recounts or runoffs. But what does that really mean? Here's a few states where there are some interesting transportation funding issues on the horizon and where the outcomes of the election could have an effect on what happens moving forward. I noted that in Colorado, we have a legislative sort of stopgap that's set to go into effect with the defeat of both those ballot measures. But that agreement was the result of sort of a compromise between Democrats in our House and Republicans in the Senate earlier this year. Now Colorado is the legislature is fully controlled by Democrats, and we also have a Democratic governor. And so with single party control in all of those different branches, there is a possibility that the transportation funding debate could be revisited. Our incoming governor, Mr. Polis, has not come out with a proposal yet exactly on what he might be thinking in terms of transportation funding, but it's certainly a state where we could see some major activity, or we could see some revision of that plan that is slated to go into effect. Connecticut's another interesting state where they've had transportation funding issues for a little while. Essentially, the transportation revenue that the state's been raising has frequently been rated to go to non-transportation purposes, and has caused a number of infrastructure problems in the state. So voters this year actually passed what they call a lockbox amendment to their constitution. Essentially, what this does is say that transportation revenue needs to stay in the transportation bucket of spending. It can't be diverted to other purposes. So that is a partial fix for some of their needs, but they are still in a little bit of a revenue shortfall situation. And the state is also now going to be fully controlled by Democrats. The governor has sort of suggested you might want to raise some of the tolls in the state to raise new revenue for transportation funding. So that's another state we'll be watching to sort of see what shakes out with the changes in power, and then also with that constitutional amendment being approved by voters. In Missouri, a gas tax increase was on the ballot this year, which failed. Again, this is the second time they've had a failure for transportation revenue. A sales tax pitch failed in 2014. Republicans retained control of the legislature and the governor's mansion in Missouri, so no change there. But I think lawmakers feel like they're in a little bit of a bind as to what to do with voters voting down both of those initiatives. They feel uncertain as to how they should go about trying to raise new transportation revenue, which is pretty desperately needed. So they'll probably have some difficult decisions to make as they go into the legislative session and think about how they try to solve that problem. And then in Minnesota, the governor there had some ambitious proposals for transportation funding as part of his campaign. But their legislature remains split, as I noted. So it's possible that there could be some gridlock there. That's been kind of a longstanding issue between Republicans in the chamber of the legislature, and then the governor wanting to do different things transportation-wise. So that'll be an ongoing debate that continues, but maybe won't see progress. We'll have to wait and see. Quick note on our e-bike campaign. I know a lot of folks out there pay pretty close attention to the work we do on e-bikes and might be wondering what the election means for those state legislative campaigns. In short, we don't expect a change here. These have been very successful bipartisan initiatives, not super political. I'd be pretty surprised if any election outcomes really had any change on the dynamics of our e-bike campaign. And here's sort of a ambitious goal we've set for 2019 to work on e-bike bills in 19 states for 2019. We've got our model bill passed in 11 as it stands today, and here's our target list of what we hope to accomplish in 2019. So we think that campaign will continue to move along pretty smoothly and hopefully bring continued success. All right, that covers our ballot initiative and state wrap-up, and I'll turn it over to Charles to talk more about what the election means federally.
Thanks so much, Alex. Similarly, some pretty big results on the federal side election night. I'll start with the House and then move to the Senate and then talk a little bit about what the impacts of the election will be on our policy efforts. But in the House currently stands at 229 Democrats, 199 Republicans. You may recall that to get the majority, you need 218. So they have a sizable majority now. There's 7 seats outstanding. Four of those are expected to probably go Republican. 3 of them are expected to go Democrat. So there's a chance that Democrats will pick up several other seats. But at this point, they've picked up 37 seats, which is pretty significant. It's very normal to have a large swing when there's a midterm election and the president's party is in power in the House. But 37 seats is pretty significant. It's even more significant because the way that the House is run, the majority controls everything. They control what's going to be on the floor, how long debates are, what's going to happen in committees, who's on committees. So they really have the ability to really dominate the agenda. So the fact that Democrats won, and won by a fairly sizable majority at this point, and likely to grow, is very significant. Another significant factor is there are 87 new members of Congress coming to town in January. That's roughly 20% of the entire Congress. Congress is 435 members. So with 87 new members, it's probably going to get closer to 90. But with that many new members, it's a lot of institutional knowledge leaving, and it's a lot of new ideas and new thought process and new direction coming in. And while a lot of those are on sort of both sides of the aisle, the fact that there's so many new people coming to Congress really will have some legitimate impact on the agenda. And it will especially have impact on the party politics. If you can imagine 50 or 60 new members coming into one party, they get a little bit more say than maybe they would if there was only 10 or 11 of them. So it was a significant night in the House. And unfortunately, because this happens in elections, we did lose some members that were pretty large bicycle advocates. And that's unfortunate. I think we've gained some also that are going to be really strong for our issues, so we're excited about that. But a really big night for Democrats in the House, and I'll go on and talk a little bit about the Senate. The Senate's a little bit of a different story. Obviously, there's 100 members. It's currently Republicans have 51 seats, so they've definitely maintained the majority. And Democrats currently have 47 seats. There's 2 seats outstanding. One is in Mississippi, which is currently in a runoff, and the other's in Florida, which is in a recount that should be potentially resolved this weekend. It's likely that the Florida seat goes Republican. That's currently held by a Democrat. It's also at this point somewhat likely that the Mississippi seat stays Republican. So it's possible that that Republicans get as many as 53 seats. It's also technically possible that Democrats get as many as 49 seats. It's not possible for Democrats to win the majority. There's a little bit of an interesting story here, though. So Republicans prior to the election had 51 seat majority, right where they are today, and they'll, as I said, they're likely to gain a couple more. But the landscape this year, the political landscape, heavily favored Republicans in the Senate. there was 34 members of the Senate that are up for election. A third of the Senate basically is up for election every 2 years. So this year there were 34 members of the Senate. The large majority of those were Democrats. 10 of them were Democrats that are in seats that Donald Trump won. So right off the bat, that's very tough to overcome. And the reality is most of them overcame that. So if Republicans pick up a couple seats, that's really good for Republicans. The reality is, based on election trends and where the numbers were, they had a really good opportunity to pick up a lot more. So it's a win for Republicans. It's also sort of somewhat of a win for Democrats given the broader landscape. A little bit about how we're looking specifically at the House and thinking about how the new majority will change things. As I said, having the majority in the House really makes a significant difference in the direction of the agenda and what's part of it. And they have the ability to pass anything that they want to without any Republican support. It's a little bit different in the Senate where everything has to be bipartisan in order to move. You need, at this point, at least 9 Democrats to move anything if the Republicans want to. In the House, you just need 218 votes, and currently Democrats have 229. So that should not be a problem. We think the House Democratic agenda is going to focus basically on 3 categories, and this is not super unusual, but with a Republican in the White House, they're going to spend a lot of time on a very aggressive oversight and investigations component, which is largely utilizing the congressional committees to look into programs and people and policies that this administration has undertaken that Democrats have some concerns with. And there's about 60 subpoenas that Democrats had requested and were denied over the last 2 years. I would assume some of those are going to come back, and since they have the votes, they'll probably get through. So there'll be a lot of effort on oversight and investigations, and that's not unusual when one chamber of Congress is different than the administration. That happened under Bush as well. Secondly, they're going to definitely move forward on a lot of what we would call messaging bills. They had a very successful campaign. Their campaign, while diverse across the country, largely focused on a number of core Democratic issues. Those will very likely be able to pass the House because of the simple math. But the reality is they will have a very hard time passing the Senate and will never get through to the president. So we call them messaging bills because they help sort of tell the Democratic campaign story, and they help speak to the base, and they'll definitely help set the stage for the 2020 election, but they're not going to go far. These things are broad immigration policy, healthcare policy, things like maybe changes to gun laws, ethics and lobbying reform, which will be their first bill. Those will all probably move through the House. They won't have a chance in the Senate, and will not make it to the president's house. So we call those messaging bills. The third is what we consider compromise legislation. There's actually a number of things that Democrats have talked about on the campaign trail that the president is also in favor of. They've both talked about a 10% cut, for example, for middle-class taxes. They've both talked about the need to rein in drug prices. They both talked about issues related to infrastructure, which we'll get into. So there are actually opportunities that, surprisingly, everybody thinks everything will come to a gridlock, but there are opportunities where there may be some compromise legislation and some real opportunity to work together as Republicans and Democrats. If you look historically, the early stages of this type of split Congress is a little bit of an awkward dance and somewhat difficult. If you think about they're going to be spending a lot of time on oversight investigations, are they going to be able to turn around and negotiate with the president? That's sort of yet to be seen. In the past, what's basically happened is it has not worked very early on. And the most recent example was the Bush administration, or the Obama administration, excuse me, and the president suffered a significant loss in the House, 63 seats, and the government shut down because they weren't able to move forward on an agenda. After that, a lot was done. So we anticipate that there is room for compromise legislation, and we want to talk a little bit about areas where we think those could happen. I already mentioned an infrastructure bill. Democrats are going to offer this as one of their first 3 priorities when they take over in January. Democrats in the Senate, Republicans in the Senate, and the president have all talked about moving forward on such a bill. The reality is we need to We need to see sort of what the details are. Everybody has a little bit of a different idea, but the very fact that they're all prioritizing infrastructure is a big win for us because we'll certainly engage on that and make sure that bicycle infrastructure is a piece of that. Secondly, the FAST Act. This is a broad 6-year bill that dictates surface transportation policy across the Department of Transportation. We are very focused on this. Most money for bicycle infrastructure actually comes from this bill. It's set to expire in 2020. They'll start debating it, we believe, a little bit early because there's a bit of a cash flow problem with the Highway Trust Fund, and they need to resolve that. So we think that 2019 could really be the beginning stages of a debate on that. That would be a big opportunity for us to shape the policy, and we're working on that with a broad coalition. Appropriations, this is how the government is funded, and we strongly believe that we have a number of big priorities that have already reached bipartisan compromise. There's a large grant program that helps fund bicycle infrastructure, for example. Republicans and Democrats are both agreeing to that, and the president has signed that into law in the past. So we feel positive about that. On public lands, we're making real bipartisan steps forward in pulling together a large recreation package. We're not sure it's going to get done this year. We don't think the dynamics in the election will shift that at all if it gets pushed to next year. So we're excited about that opportunity. And this is sort of unparalleled recreation policy across the board, from the Land and Water Conservation Fund to streamlining regulations to ensure that guides and outfitters can access lands better. So we feel really good about those prospects. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier in the call, there's a possibility that they could move forward on some tax legislation. Democrats and Republicans both want to do this. And if they do that, there's going to be an opportunity potentially to highlight a couple of tax priorities that we have that frankly were eliminated the last time Congress moved forward on tax policy. And those include things like the commuter tax benefit for bicycles. So it's an interesting election. It certainly splits the Congress, makes one chamber controlled by the Republicans and one controlled by the Democrats. We'll see how all of this plays out in January. It will certainly be a little bit difficult for everybody to adjust to the new landscape, but they'll adjust. And when they adjust, we hope that we can be a big part of the discussion on the group of bills where there may be bipartisan compromise. So with that, I'll push it back to Alex.
Thank you, Charles. We do want to give a quick thank you to all of our coalition members who make the work we do possible. You know, we can't work on ballot initiatives and work in state legislatures and work with members of Congress on all the important initiatives that Charles just highlighted without the support from our coalition members. So a big thank you to everybody who is a member of People for Bikes. And for those of you that aren't members of People for Bikes yet, please consider joining the coalition so that we can continue to accomplish all the great things that we're doing for biking and the bike industry. And with that, we will take some questions here. In your GoToWebinar control panel, you should have a little question box on the probably right side of your screen. And if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and type that in, and we'll take as many as we can here. One question, will the slides be available afterwards? Yes, we will have a recording of the webinar and the slides posted on our website, and we'll shoot that information out to you via email.
There's a question about the 2020 election, and specifically in the Senate, and does that look better than the 2018 election? So as I said, about a third of the Senate is up every year. This one, just by the nature of what seats were up, heavily favored Republicans. The next one is going to be the opposite. So there's a lot more Republicans that are up for election in some traditionally difficult Republican seats. So based on the general landscape, this far out, it looks like Democrats have a bit of an advantage in the next election. But the reality is things change significantly when the presidential election is happening, and a lot of the down ballot races are carried by the president or the presidential nominees. So we'll have to determine that, but simply based on the numbers, there's a lot of Republicans that are up for election next year, or in 2020. We have a really good question about what do we think could be happening in the lame duck session. And for those of you unfamiliar with the insider phrase there, the lame duck session refers to the period after the election but before the new Congress. So everybody that was just elected actually doesn't take office till January 3rd. So between now and January 3rd, it will be the same group of members of Congress that have been serving for the last 2 years. And the lame duck is sort of an interesting period because members come back into town, the elections are over, the dynamics a little bit differently without sort of the political risk attached to votes and everything else. So they try to get a lot done in the lame duck. There's a couple things that absolutely have to be done. One, not entirely related to us, but we do have some provisions we're working on in there, and that is the Farm Bill. This is the large bill that authorizes all programs within the Department of Agriculture. We're trying to work with some partner organizations to insert some recreation-type language in terms of funding within the Department of Agriculture. So we'll see how that goes. They're in pretty serious negotiations on that front. And the biggest sort of ticket item that will really determine what else moves for the rest of the lame duck session is all of the outstanding funding for the federal government, except for 3 or 4 departments. All of the others expires on December 7th. And there's a big battle right now between Republicans and Democrats on how to move that funding. So if they don't find some solution, and there's basically 2 solutions, they could either pass a very large package of bills, which they often do, to fund the government, or they could pass just a straight extension of current funding into next year. If they don't reach one of those solutions, we would have what's referred to as a government shutdown. The government can't operate without money, and there's a long list of problems associated with that. So by December 7th, we have to deal with funding, and that's really important. And that, as I said, will dictate a lot of other policies. So, for example, I had mentioned the recreation package. We're hoping a public lands or recreation package moves. Some of that is really dependent on what other large bills are able to move, and that is largely dependent on what happens on the funding side. So we're watching that very closely. There's also a handful of other sort of tax-related fixes to our tax code that need to be done by the end of the year. If they're not done, they can retroactively fix it, but they're trying to get it done by the end of the year. I think the new Democratic majority would really like to start next year with sort of a clean agenda and be able to move forward and not have to deal with things from this past year. So I know they're working towards that, and I'm sure Republicans are trying to get a couple of their priorities done prior to losing the majority. So it's an interesting situation. We expect it to be pretty active between now and the first week of December. Next week, they're ironically not in town because of Thanksgiving, but after that, they will be. And it will be a time to try to put all the negotiators around the table and see what can be done. I'll only add one other thing. This is also the time where the new Congress picks their leadership. So Republicans did that this week. Democrats will do it the week after the Thanksgiving recess, so the week after next. And that also helps give a little bit of insight into the direction of where the Congress will be going next year.
Great. Thanks, Charles. Another question, how do we as a shop get more involved in bicycle advocacy in our local area? Great question. You know, a lot of the things that Charles and I have highlighted related to transportation funding, we may pass legislation that opens those pots of money up to be spent on bike infrastructure, but ultimately it's local governments that end up getting the projects, applying for a federal match to get the projects on the ground and actually spending the money. So what happens at the local level is very important to actually get those resources to come down to your communities and get infrastructure put on the ground. So I'd encourage you, if you're a retailer or a supplier out there who's interested in doing more, connect with the local bicycle advocacy group in your community if you have one already. If you don't, try to be the catalyst to get things moving in your area by connecting with your city council members, or your parks commission may be very influential as well as in terms of what projects actually end up being developed. So those sort of 3 ways could be really great ways to plug in. Meet your local advocacy group, see what they're working on, meet members of your city council, and also get in touch with the parks commission in your city or county. Question on the recording. We'll try and get that recording hosted with the slides probably by Monday. It does take a little bit of time to get that processed and put up, so we'll probably aim to have that up early next week.
There's a really good question about, does the new House majority have any impact on import duties? This is referring to the administration's recent actions that have had a significant impact on the bicycle industry of increasing tariffs on products from China, including bicycles and bicycle products and e-bikes. The new majority, I think out of all of the things that we think they're going to be very focused on, they'll obviously be closely monitoring it and seeing what happens. They don't have unilateral jurisdiction to be able to unwind that necessarily, and we don't anticipate that moving the existing tariffs back as being one of their big priorities. There's another really good question on the infrastructure bill and if there's any information on potential funding. So on infrastructure and transportation broadly, the thing that always holds it up, which is somewhat expected, is a lack of funding. So there's a lot of really good ideas on the infrastructure side. Because of the ability to get things through the House and Senate, you really need to, generally speaking, have it funded, or at least partially funded, but you really need it funded. And right now, there's not a revenue source to do that on the infrastructure side. On the transportation policy side, it's funded by gas taxes, and that is becoming a little bit of a problem because the fund doesn't have enough money to keep up with growth in the transportation sector. So they're trying to find some alternatives to that. Obviously, people have been pushing for an increase in the gas tax for a long time, which I anticipate the Democrats will continue to do. That has not gained a lot of traction in D.C. up to this point, but I know people are really trying to think outside the box with new innovative policies on how to address these problems. So a question about the Land and Water Conservation Fund reauthorization, and does the funding deadline impact this? The funding deadline doesn't actually impact the authorization of the LWCF. Unfortunately, that has expired, but they are working to try to get that done in this lame duck session. The really great news on the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and for those of you that are not familiar with it, this is largely on the federal level, at least, largely a land acquisition program, and it really helps recreation and conservation at the same time. The great news on the LWCF is that both the House and the Senate committees that deal with public lands have both passed separate bills that would permanently authorize the Land and Water Conservation Fund. This is a really big deal because part of the problem with the Land and Water Conservation Fund is that every couple of years they have this big debate on whether to authorize it and at what levels. So if there can be a permanent authorization, it takes the worry and the risk out of it and allows everybody to focus on how to fund it. And so the authorization is hopefully going to get done in this lame duck session, but there was a really strong bipartisan vote in the House and Senate committees on this that gave us a lot of reason to be excited about the potential for getting this actually signed into law.
Question on e-bike legislation. What happened to your plans for e-bike legislation in North Carolina? Excellent question. Obviously, we have a lot of states on that target list, and there's a lot of factors that go into how we're selecting those based on a local, constituent in place that really wants to work on the issue, a bill sponsor, things like that. We sort of have this second tier of states where we feel like we're really close to getting something moving, and that is where North Carolina sits right now. So I'd be happy to tell you a little bit more about that offline if you're curious, and I'll follow up with you individually.
A question about the Farm Bill and why it would impact our industry. So the overwhelming majority of the Farm Bill deals with direct agriculture policy, which obviously we don't necessarily play a role in that I'm familiar with. But it also deals with a number of programs, including grant programs that are authorized by the Department of Agriculture that go to a lot of especially rural activities. And we've always looked at the Farm Bill as a possible way to make sure that from a rural policy standpoint, we're ensuring that there's a recreation component as well. And in some cases there is, in some cases there isn't. So we're working with some partner organizations to see if we can expand that a little bit. It's a little tough at this late stage, so we may need to take that up again next year. But given that the Farm Bill is in really active negotiations, I know there's some effort behind trying to work on that.
We had a question on Proposition 110 in Colorado, or maybe more of a comment that I think one person said they were happy to see Prop 110 fail. And I think it's actually worth noting a couple things about 110. It certainly wasn't a flawless ballot proposition. Some people did feel that it didn't go far enough in terms of providing money to alternative forms of transportation, and maybe mixed up some of the funding in the multimodal fund too much between transit and active transportation. So those are absolutely fair criticisms. When we looked at the overall landscape of what the sort of three main options were in Colorado, 110, felt like the most appealing one, not only to us, but to other bike advocacy groups in the state, as well as a lot of sort of conservation and green mobility groups in the state. So it did have a very broad coalition in support, but I think those criticisms are well noted, and hopefully things that can be improved down the road if the state decides to take the issue on again. Another question on e-bikes. What's the status of e-bike regulations at the federal level? Will we see them removed from the motorized vehicles classification? So I interpret this question to be directed mostly at public lands, because electric bicycles are regulated as motor vehicles by all of the major federal land management agencies like the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management or the National Park Service. And that is an issue that we're working on. The fix, unfortunately, is not so simple. At a minimum, it would require a reinterpretation of existing federal regulations, or possibly an amendment of federal regulations. So not something that's going to happen overnight. Definitely a long-term project, but a very important project. And it is something we're working with those federal land management agencies on. Question on e-scooters. Are you working on any strategy to leverage the popularity of e-scooters into building more bike infrastructure? Great question. Scooter question is complicated. But no, to answer the question, we are actually in communication with the e-scooter folks. I think that their industry is still sort of getting off the ground. And it's quite early for them. They're working on a lot of things to just sort of grow their industry and see where they end up. And it could be a great opportunity to have another constituent that's interested in building a lot more bike infrastructure so that their user group can safely get around cities. So that's absolutely something that's on our radar. But we'll see where it goes. All right, it's 9:45. I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. We really appreciate everybody tuning into the webinar today, and appreciate the really good questions that you asked. Like I said, we'll shoot out a follow-up email that contains a link to both the slides and a recording of the webinar. If you want to share that, or in case you missed part of it, you'll be able to watch that again. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your time today.